Now, when I plan water harvesting systems, I start from the top of the watershed and I work my way down. I also work out from the valleys to the ridges. In this case, the site doesn't take in an entire watershed. In other words, we don't have a main ridge that gives way to these primary valleys. Our area of work starts within the primary valleys. But if we did have a main ridge, the first type of pond that I would be looking at is a saddle pond. This is a pond that would be located right along the saddle between two bluffs along the main ridge. And in this case, that saddle pond would likely be somewhere up here, just off the property boundary.
So we're standing on a saddle that's running from the east down west into the Willamette Valley, looking down into a saddle pond. This is a special, unique pond feature. You don't see very many saddle ponds, but when you do have a saddle, you have a really unique opportunity to have a high elevation storage and a lot of storage for really fairly minimal amount of earth moving. Now, a saddle pond is often built not literally right onto the crest of the saddle, but sometimes onto the side of the saddle on one side or another. And that's pretty much what we're seeing here. This pond is called Spirit Pond, and it was built by our friend Noah Wemple years ago to be the header pond for a cider orchard on the property. It takes water from a road that cuts along the saddle ridge, and that road feeds water runoff to a ditch, and the road also scoops water off the spring and a seep that is carried into the inlet over on that side. And I believe there's a number of other seeps that also feed this pond. You can see that there's access all the way around it. There's hundreds of feet of drop for firefighting purposes or for microhydro in the wintertime. There's even completely accessible helicopter access for scooping in the event of fire. A saddle pond can be a really special and useful type of pond when you have the type of landscape context that allows for it. Now, even though there is not much of a drainage area here, there still is theoretically a saddle stretch that runs along the main ridge of this entire watershed. And that main ridge is a perfect spot to maintain as a mainframe access road system. And so that access road can travel up and around the side of the next bluff there that you can see with the fir trees on the horizon. And that entire road can then become a water harvesting feature. If you're fortunate enough to have this type of topography, your roads can double as significant water harvesting features for the site and also be firefighting access ways and fire breaks along the most gentle and flattest part of the landform.
The next thing that I would look to is whether or not there's a high elevation point that has a minimal enough slope to create either a turkey's nest pond, which is an excavated pond that has an embankment all the way around it, and then it's lined. Essentially, it's an open reservoir at a high point to store water. This water would need to be pumped and distributed some way from a reliable source. Alternatively, rather than just an open reservoir, this same location could be a place to store water in a larger tank, especially if the water was not to be used for agricultural purposes, but for potable purposes, drinking water purposes. So looking at this landscape, one potential location for a tank like that is right here. So we'll just mark that. That's one of the highest locations on the property. Another potential spot is right up here, just about the same elevation on the other ridge. Now let's look at the line of the ridge line. So the ridge divide line is an important line to identify, and it can be difficult sometimes with these sort of young, oddly shaped coastal mountains. But I'm just going to go ahead and draw a line along the center line of the ridge, of each ridge that we're working with. This would be the spot that when you stand along the ridge looking down, you can see both directions in a really good way. This will help people sort of see the pattern of the ridges and the valleys. Now they're pretty much going up close, at least, to the location of this road. Now if we draw in the valleys, we have this one here. And then here's our main stream corridor. So the first type of pond that I look for is the key point pond. And that's going to be at the location where the landscape goes from being quite steep to flattening out, as well as opening up and widening. Every valley has a key point, and generally they'll be in locations that move slightly downslope, moving in the same fall as the main ridge. So in this valley, it's a little difficult to see with the contours, but my judgment would place the key point actually just a little bit off of the property line. But if we nudge it down right here, that's going to be a key point pond in that valley. So standing here on one of the primary ridges on this property, we're looking down into a primary valley. And in terms of assessing the potential location of a key point pond, we're standing at a place where we can see, despite a lot of the tree cover, that as you move down the valley, it gets increasingly flat, and it also increasingly widens out and opens up. And so down in this area, we're likely to find a place where a lot of water accumulates. It also, as it relates to the ridgeline, below that location in the valley, out on the ridge, we have a broadening and flattening of the ridgeline divide. And that's a location where we could have an opportunity to move water from the valley out to a ridged pond that could then also service irrigation to gardens and orchards and the home sites just downhill of that. That key line then from the key point becomes a management divide between the upper closed forest and more intensive agroforestry and gardens below, and allows us to create a road system along that same line that can service as a fire break between those two land uses. So let's head down into this valley and see what we can find in terms of water. So here we are, down in the draw, and about at the location that we identified in the map earlier. And in real world scenario, we can see that there's quite a few signs that this is a water point. One is, look at this wildlife trail here. There are animals are coming through right on contour, right to the place where the water starts in the landscape. And there's obviously just this corridor of vine maple and sword fern and salal, which in this environment really is a sign of water. And then of course we have this the water itself, which is clear and cold. It's just beginning to gully as it moves from a more flat section back into a steep decline. And that's often something that you'll see at a key point. You'll see that where the water begins to accumulate and then runs downstream, it begins to channelize. So this is also an opportunity to sort of get in there and do some work to mitigate that channelization. So we'd very likely want to end up putting our key point pond just a little bit upstream of this, just about where that gully starts and right where the water starts. This is a wonderful find, this water here at the key point. In this valley, you can see it's quite steep in here and it's narrow, and then it begins to widen out right through here. It widens further and it becomes even less steep. There's almost a natural terrace in this location. So this is another key point in this valley.
So we've come now to a key point pond that was actually built in a key point in the next valley over on the same property here. As you can see, it's not a very large pond. It focuses really on function over storage in a lot of cases. Due to the size of the valley at this elevation and other factors, as in our case, we put this pond right up at the top of the property, so the boundary is just on the other side of this big Douglas fir tree, in order to have it be as high as possible. The key point pond isn't often used for large water storage, but is also used for strategic diversion. So this pond could have what's water routed to a swale or a subtle drain or a trickle tube that feeds a pipe out to a pond on the ridgeline. And that pond could be larger in size. The key point pond also, because it's in a riparian area, may end up overlapping with vegetation and species that are more sensitive or threatened and endangered. And so there also is a logic in not building a major impoundment in a riparian zone. So one of the things too that a pond like this offers is stored water all through the summer. The impacts, the changes that come from year-round water in our Mediterranean climate are really profound. And wildlife utilize this pond regularly. They also bring in seed, and you never know what's really going to emerge. I mean, since I've been here last, we have papyrus establishing in the margins of this pond. So it's also just a really highly biodiverse space in the landscape.
We can determine the key line off of these key points by following the natural contour along the same elevation as the key point. So if we just mark that in green, this can help us look at the next location of a pond. So moving from the valley out to the ridge, we can look to the potential location of a ridge pond, or sometimes called a hillside pond. And the hillside pond, even though it's not naturally going to be able to capture runoff water very effectively, if placed just downhill but out on the ridge from the key point pond, we can fill that pond either through diversion drains along roads or through pipelines, and have that water be in a strategic high elevation point for irrigation, and also on a landform that allows for large storage.
We're standing here on the top of a ridge in a headwaters valley looking down into a ridgeline pond. This pond was built to be a water supply reservoir for a ranch. It's about 100-foot elevation above the ranch itself, and it's fed by a small key point pond located just on the side of this ridgeline. So this pond is also fed from below, where there's a bit of subsurface water also feeding it, and the two water sources are enough to keep this pond full of water year-round. In fact, it's enough to feed a series of ponds that run down the side of this ridge. One of the great things about a pond in this landscape position is that it gives you substantial amount of opportunity, should you have this type of topography, to have a high elevation, large water storage. In this valley, the actual drainages are fairly small, but there's wide spreading ridgeline bluffs. And so if you can get that water out from the place where it accumulates in the valley out onto the bluff, you're golden as far as water storage goes and water volumes. It's also a site, soils wise and plant species wise, that there's really no concern for the impacts on wetlands or rare species associated with wetland habitats. We're able to also navigate some code and regulations around where those types of earthworks can be done. So standing on the dam of the uppermost pond, we're looking down now at two more ponds below in series along the side of this ridge. One of the things to note is the old mature forest on the slope just uphill of the pond. That is the source. That's what's feeding this system. And a series of springs and seeps right at the point where that land flattens out is where the initial catchment is for this pond system. And that catchment then is routed to the uppermost pond and then flows through the system. Together, the three ponds create a sustainable water supply for the farm. And you can see at the upper pond here, we have a solar array that in part provides the electricity for a pumping system that circulates water throughout the property and adds pressure to the system. One of the things to note on this side is the role of a mature north-facing forest in its production of water. And this hill slope is very steep, and it's a very relatively small catchment. Yet, because of a number of factors, it still yields tons of water. And one of those factors would be that it's enclosed canopy, mature mixed hardwood and conifer forests. The other could be that it's on a north-facing slope. And this is where, in our region, you see at the landscape scale, many springs coming off of the north faces of geology. Sometimes that would be because the rocks are uplifted in such a way that the springs seep out. But other times it just has to do with the microclimate effects of that north face. So looking at this from the landscape perspective, this is a really ideal location in terms of water's location in the landscape. The other thing we can see is that just the connection between these ponds and their function for fire protection, the maintenance and protection of these beautiful forests, and because of the viability of this site to bring in a helicopter to scoop water for firefighting purposes, these ponds are in service, well, not just to the surrounding forest and farm, but to the entire neighborhood. In some places, there's opportunities to put in ponds for fire control. And, through the USDA and the NRCS, there's some funding to put in ponds also for farm use and other purposes. But that funding is not always available. And so it's definitely important also to look to areas where that funding is available and advocate for it to be made available in your area. This is an example of another ridge pond. This one is situated on a very flat ridge, and the dam actually is built up on either side. This would almost qualify really as a saddle pond if this was at the top of the main ridge. But as you can see, it's coming off of that main ridge on a primary ridge. And so there's an opportunity to capture water off of that upper ridge. And in this case, that's done by running water in a road that is graded inset into the slope and towards the pond from both directions. So over on to the left and the right, water is carried from that road around this bluff right to the inlet on the left side of the pond. And that's what feeds this ridgeline pond. This pond gives us a good opportunity to look at the inside and outside slopes of the dam. On a pond of this size, wide enough to accommodate vehicle traffic is a really good idea. So we have a nice wide top to our dam. And then on the outside slope, we can afford to have a little bit more steepness. If you look at this contour, you can see that the contour is widest right along the spine of the ridge. And there's a potential location for a ridge pond right around here.
we could do this for all of these ridges. But in our case, we're really wanting to maximize our water storage in this area. We can see that this side is really quite steep. Just knowing from experience, that's not a good location to have a pond. On this side here, we're at least at this point going to reserve the same landform, which could be a good location for a pond, for a forestry materials staging and processing site. So we can connect our ridge ponds via the keyline pond. Now, one of the things that I like to avoid is unnecessarily diverting water out of one drainage into another. One way we can avoid this is to designate one of these ponds as having a natural spillway that will feed this pond, and then this pond can overflow via a natural spillway back to the original drainage, while the other pond can serve this just through a pipeline. We can install a trickle tube, which we'll speak more about, at this key point pond, and run just a portion of the water, just sipping the surplus water off of this key point pond and running it to the ridge. And then another trickle tube can feed this water back to another larger pond just downstream. Now let's go back to the valley. We can look for good locations for our first valley ponds, and these are sometimes also called goalie ponds. I think of goalie pond as a more narrow channel, whereas valley ponds, when they get to be on really level ground and a low point in a valley where it's spreading out in the floodplain, these ponds are some of the biggest ponds we have. So the shape and size of valley ponds can really vary depending on their position in the landscape.
We're here now at the Heart Pond on Cougar Mountain, and this was built by Noah many years ago, and we want to dedicate this video to our friend Noah Wemple, who passed this year, who really embodies so much of what we aspire to in permaculture, to make physical the visions that we have for the world. When I think of anybody who puts their heart but also their body into the work of permaculture, I first think of Noah. This is dedicated to him, and this pond was built at the start of a big project to establish a cider orchard and really a community and a festival space on this mountain. And core to that vision was the water to support it. This pond went in at just a beautiful spot above the orchard. It takes water from a seasonal draw that comes down off of this hill, and it also scoops water off of a road that runs up all the way to a saddle pond at the top of the ridge. And so from both directions, water feeds both edges of this heart and fills this big, beautiful, broad pond. The pond really is sitting at the outlet of a wide, broad, but relatively small valley. So this is an example too of what you can do with a valley pond in terms of its shape and its size and its edge once you have that nice flat opening at the bottom of the valley. That relative flatness allows you to get really creative in the way that you shape the pond. A few other notable things about this pond. One, the main access road for the property crosses the dam. So there's always the opportunity to access this water with tanker truck for any sort of fire need. The dam itself is an access. It's located at the top of the beginning of all of the essentially developed agricultural areas on the property. So it's really the highest location that one could put a large pond like this on the landscape. And so it's very well placed and, well thought out positioning for the pond. This pond is big enough, it's been stocked with fish and supplies more than 1 million gallons of water for the operation here.
Let's look to some of the spots for our first higher elevation valley ponds. So if we are routing water from a key point just downhill to a ridge pond and feeding it back to a valley pond, our first location for a valley pond then is just down elevation of our ridgeline pond. here's a great location for our valley pond. It's a nice landform and that allows for a lot of storage.
This is the first example of a valley pond that we can look at. This pond is just downstream of the Key Point Pond here at the Center for Rural Livelihoods. And it is the highest elevation pond that we presently have that serves as a water supply pond for the site. In a valley location, a little bit lower down in elevation, you have a far greater opportunity to build a large storage. This pond is at the highest location that we could really adequately get volume. And we have stored here probably about 300,000 gallons of water. That water also is adjacent to a forestry access road system. So this pond also serves as a pumping location, a chance to pump for fire control. And it gives us the means of having stored water for forestry year round. In addition, the dam of the pond crossing at this point gives us access across the valley onto the next ridge over. The dam then also serves as a diversion point for water to be routed back out to the ridge where it could service another pond on the ridge.
And again, coming down through here, this is a tight canyon. I would have a look right here where the contour starts to spread out as well as open up. I'm going to mark that as a potential valley pond site. Down below where this road crosses through, there's an opportunity to build a larger pond there. And then again, we can look to a few more potential locations throughout here. We could essentially pop in a few more ponds down through this draw. These ponds could be part of an aquaculture system. And then at the end, where the main road crosses again, we have another potential site for a pond.
We're standing in a unique landscape context where we have an opportunity to create a broad and shallow aquaculture pond. Now this pond is located at the very bottom toe of a primary ridge, and it's at the point where the land drops away very quickly down to the main creek. So the soils in this particular area are very shallow. They're 1 to 2 feet deep in most cases. So it's not an opportune site to build a deep and big pond, but nonetheless, it serves as a really very good location for aquaculture. Now, located at the bottom of a micro watershed, this pond also serves a nutrient accumulation, sediment accumulation, and filtration function in the context of a whole system's ecological aquaculture or integrated earthworks that starts from the ridge and makes its way all the way down to the creek. In the context of that system, this pond filters out any nutrients and sediment that would move through the system before it gets back to the creek. And in doing so, creates a very productive environment for vegetation. The first 3 feet or so of a pond in water depth is the most productive for plant growth. It's where there's the most light. And so you have the most vegetative productivity in the first 3 feet. And this pond then being 3 to 4 feet deep is really emphasizing plant growth. So we have wapato in the foreground in a deeper pocket that stays wet year round. In the background, we have rushes. We have patches of giant bulrush that grow here. We have fuki. We have the native coltsfoot. We have gunnera. And a lot of these species also are big broadleaf species, so they are mulch plants. Not only can we harvest them for food and fiber, but we can harvest them as mulch material for the garden. This is a multifunctional pond. The way that it's been designed is to give access across a seasonally wet section of the property. So the dam also serves multiple functions. It's an access way into a residential section of the property and utilized very frequently, so it's a more intensively managed. So this is another aquaculture pond. This one is just uphill of our other pond, and as you can see, again, it's very shallow. I'm standing on a bedrock shelf here. And then there's this, 1 to 2 foot deep bog in the foreground. The water comes in here. It fills the basin. The nutrient and sediment are filtered out, and then it connects over and it runs out across the ridge to the other ridgeline pond that completes that sort of aquaculture filtration function at the bottom of this pond system. So all of this material, all of this sedge here, for instance, can be gathered every year, and we then will cut it, carry it just across to the garden here where it's turned into compost and incorporated into our beds. So this type of pond really provides for biomass and food and a nutrient and sediment filtration function at the bottom of the system. From a garden perspective, this pond really serves a lot of functions, and one of them is that the water percolates as a lens underneath this dam and goes through, again, this shallow soil. Below the dam, we've put in hugelkultur. The woody material buried in the ground acts as a sponge, and we've built berms on top of that to create a long-term source of sort of nutrients and water supply to these garden beds. Eventually, these will probably be planted into raspberries and blueberries and not have to be irrigated at all, just through the lens of water that comes off of this pond. Also, the habitat role that this plays is really significant. The sound of spring peepers all year on the land, and the pest control, the slug control that's brought by frogs in the habitat is really significant, not to mention just the diversity, the mosaic of habitat that comes from these wet pockets in what was once completely arid landscape.
It's worth noting too that we could be diverting some of this water out to another large ridge pond here on this bluff. But as is so often the case, prior development has already occurred here because people noticed that was such a lovely place to build. With a little more forethought around water harvesting infrastructure, another large pond could potentially be built right around here with the cabins just above. Now let's look at connecting our road system. Right here is where we have one of our main mill sites, and then we have another one right here. But we want to have a few more landings up in the woods, and we want to have that circulation potential for forestry. We'll draw in forest road that follows this pattern. Get up to the top here. This road can drop down, carrying water, first pond, and cross it. The road can then cut across here and carry water to this pond here, and then hook in there. Can follow the spine of the ridge up to our water tank. The road could also spur off here and reach up to a crossing at this upper key point pond. This would allow water to be carried down this road to fill our ridge pond, water down this road to fill our valley pond, water down this road also to fill our valley pond, and then water down here to fill this valley pond. Now we have a differentiation of forest use, more low-intensive forest management uphill of our road, and downhill we have more agroforestry, grazing, and more intensive agriculture. And we have a water supply to service both of our main zones of use.